Hi everyone, and welcome to the next chapter from Nimzowicz's My System. It's the final chapter of the book and entitled Maneuvering. In summary, we will cover in this chapter maneuvering against an enemy weakness, then the combined attack on both wings, and finally a look at the link between these two strategies. Okay, so first of all we will identify the logical elements upon which maneuvering against a weakness are based, and then we'll look at the idea of a pivot in a position around which this maneuvering is based. The general plan is in the process of maneuvering is usually as follows. Our opponent has a weakness that can be attacked in two or more ways, but either way we choose runs into a satisfactory defense. In order to exploit the weakness, we alternate the two methods at our disposal, generally through the use of a space advantage. In so doing, we oblige our opponent to give his pieces uncomfortable defensive positions. This leads to restraint being imposed upon the pieces that in turn results in the weaknesses becoming untenable. To the amateur eye, this process often appears to be achieving nothing, as it involves the continued movement of pieces to and fro with no clear objective. But any strong player will understand what's going on. It sounds simple, but it's often a complicated process. First of all, we have to consider the position on the board, which Nimzowitsch refers to as the terrain. In order for maneuvering to be successful, the terrain must be well consolidated and relatively stable. A common feature is that the reorganization of pieces will take place via a specific square, rank, or file. In the position here is the d5 square that white will use to perform his maneuvering, where he has the knight now. It can be considered a fortified outpost and a pivot point. All of white's pieces would stand well on the d5 square, even the rook. It will apply pressure to the d6 pawn and along the fifth rank. One of the principles of maneuvering is that each of the pieces can occupy this square in turn, and in so doing create continued threats for our opponent to deal with. The relationship between the pieces and this square is exactly the same kind of important contact that was explored in the chapter on overprotection. White could, for example, play knight e3, queen d5, and knight c4 here, in order to apply pressure to d6 and also to a5 with the knight on c4, and so on, and reorganize the pieces and keep applying the pressure, so black has to defend and then exploit the situation. So it'll become clearer. We'll look at a concrete example now. Here's the first one here. This position was reached by the great endgame player Rubinstein with white against Selezniev, and it features an instructive example of endgame maneuvering. The h7 pawn will be subject to attack on both the 7th rank and the open file. So black to move played b6, although d4 was probably better in Nimzowicz's view. So bishop f2, threatening to win the exchange. So rook f8, now rook e1, rook e f7, and this is allowing some exchanges. So rook takes e6, rook takes f2, rook e8 check, king b7, rook f8, rook f8, now rook e7, attacking from the 7th rank. So now came rook h8, king f2, king c6, g4, king d6, rook f7, a5, g5, a4, h4, b5, king g3. We'll get into the position now where the maneuvering will take place. And after c5, black is threatening to create a passed pawn with this b4 push, and Rubinstein now maneuvers the rook to a better post. After rook f6 check, king c7, rook h6. And the reason why that's a better post will become clear in a second. b4, c takes b4, a takes b4, a takes b4, now rook a8 to support the advance of the pawn and allowing rook takes h7 check the weakness falls, but black is forced to do this, so he's just going to be completely passive. So king b6, now rook f7, a3, rook f1, a2, rook a1, so all forced. So king b5 and now g6, king takes b4 and h5, and black resigned. It's completely lost here against the connected passed pawn. So this is a simple example, and it's just to get the ball rolling. The important thing to note is how the rook used the squares from e7 to h7 and h6 to h8 as a pivot for its attacking maneuver. It's also relevant that Rubinstein played this maneuver at the optimal moment. He could not play it earlier than when he did, or the game could have gone very differently. So now we'll look at a more complicated example. This is an example from one of Nimzowicz's own games. Here he had black against a man called Kalashnikov. The positional elements to note here are the fact that white has two weaknesses that black can attack, c3 and h3. And this issue of having two combined pawn weaknesses is the key to the maneuvering we will see. And it appears that black's control of f4, which is crucial to maintain the pressure on h3, can be challenged by white through exchanges, but Nimzowitsch manages to maintain it through attacking the other weak pawn at the same time. Thus there's a logical and positional connection between the two areas of the board. So we'll flip this quickly so we can see from Nimzowicz's point of view. So he's attacking h3 and c3. His first move was king e7, and the problem for white is that if he remains passive, black will gain a winning attack through bringing his king to g6 and playing f5. And you know, this is going to force white to play f3 pretty much, and after which black can get his bishop to g3, which is going to undermine the entire defensive setup here that white is utilizing. So white played actively in order to avoid this, knight g2. So he's threatening exchanges that are going to lead to a draw. So black plays rook a1 check, and rook c1, and now rook a2. And if white now exchanges on f4, he'll be facing a very tough endgame thanks to this powerful 7th rank rook. But white is clearly a very resourceful player, continuing here with knight e1, losing a tempo but keeping his solid defensive setup. We can have a quick look at the position if he exchanges, just to understand Nimzowicz's play. If bishop takes f4, attacking the rook, rook d1, knight takes f4 is simply losing. Bishop d2, and now a knight e2 to defend c3, and now knight f4 wins it for black. For example, if knight takes f4, g takes f4, king g2 to prevent f3 winning the pawn on c3, and now rook c2, and black wins. So back to the game, and black has won a tempo. After knight e1, he can play king f7, and now rook c2, he plays rook a3, and you know, black of course doesn't allow exchanges but forces white to give him another beneficial move instead. Again, he definitely should not trade on f4. Bishop takes f4, knight takes f4. White is even more tangled up than he is at the moment. So knight g2, now rook a1 check, rook c1, now rook a2. A repetition, but black is gaining a tempo each time, and this is maneuvering. So now comes knight e1, king g6, rook c2, rook a3, and f3. And in fact, there's no way white could avoid playing this weakening move due to the threat of f5, and then f takes g5, f takes g4, h takes g4, and pass pawn. So he has to play f3. And it's very instructive how Nimzowitsch milks as much as possible out of the position. So now comes f5, king f2, king f6. This is making space for the knight to move so that he can play bishop g3. So bishop c1, rook a1, king e3, knight g6, knight d3. This is the threat is knight e to f4 at the moment from black, and this has to be met. So bishop g3. Sorry, my mistake. Now the threat is knight e f4, and there's no exchanging. If he takes with the knight, then takes with check, and the bishop hangs on c1. So knight e2. Now knight e f4 attacking h3. White played knight g1. If instead knight takes f4, then knight takes f4, and white is even more passive. To defend h3, he has to play knight g1. Again, he can't exchange, or he's losing the bishop. And now bishop e1 with a winning position. The threat is rook a7 to e7, and it's going to be mate, and white is actually now forced to play knight e2, just dropping the h-pawn in the game. Another thing that doesn't work, instead of knight g1, is knight e takes f4. Knight takes f4, and there's no way to defend h3. If knight f2, then bishop takes f2, king takes f2, knight d3 check, wins the bishop. So knight g1, now knight takes d3, king takes d3, and bishop f4. A slick move to force simplifications. Black is exploiting the pin on the bishop. It can't move, or g1 is dropping. If bishop takes f4, knight takes f4 is check, and the knight is going to drop afterwards. And the bishop is now attacked twice, so he has to defend with knight e2, but this means that h3 is falling. Bishop takes c1, knight takes c1. If knight takes c1, knight f4 check. Is going to win h3 after an exchange on c1 next. So knight takes c1, and now knight f4 check, king e3, knight takes h3. The fruits of black's hard maneuvering work. So knight e2, f4 check, and here white resigned because rook f1 is coming next. It's going to win another pawn. So it's a very instructive example and a model endgame from Nimzowitsch. Okay, so this is a different example where the king is another weakness against which we can attack. Nimzowitsch reached this position with white against Kalinsky in 1914. We'll see from Nimzowicz's point of view. He's a rook up, but he's facing three connected pass pawns. Black is threatening f2 and rook g1. So how to continue? Nimzowitsch played bishop b3, and it's important to note that if he plays instead bishop c2, trying to slow down the pawns due to the pressure on e4, black can play f2, and after rook d1, king e6, and it becomes impossible for white to win from here. So bishop b3, d4, bishop d5, rook g4 to defend e4. Now rook h, h5, f2, and now white doubles rooks on the f file, which is going to create what Nimzowitsch refers to as a demarcation line through which the black king cannot pass. So rook f6 check, king e7, rook h f5, rook g1 check, king a2, and now d3. And you know, white certainly needs nerves of steel here, but Nimzowitsch has everything under control. In fact, he uses this position as an exemplar of his teachings. For, as he has laid out, the action of maneuvering only takes place when certain conditions are met, namely the presence of a pivot through which the pieces can move, and secondly, a multiplicity of threats that can be directed against a weakness. Analyzing this position, it is clear that both of these elements exist. In the previous examples, the weakness was a pawn. Here, it's the black king. As far as threats are concerned, white can play against the king and force him to the edge of the board with mating ideas, or he can force the king into the center of the board with similar threats. The pivot point for white is the F file, the line of demarcation that the white king cannot pass, and it's very instructive how Nimzowitsch breaks these things down. Given this position, I'm sure many of us would play in the same manner, or at least in a similar manner, but our thinking would not be as clear, probably simply going for mate. But Nimzowitsch has a habit of distilling the truth and its factors from the position that I find really brings the position into focus. So as the play unfolds, we'll see lots of toing and froing about, which, when we understand the principles at work, is clearly the correct and strongest way to play. So rook e6 check, king d7, rook f7 check, king d8. The king is forced to the edge of the board. Now rook e f6. And actually nowadays with an engine it's clear that rook d6 check is in fact stronger here with a forced mate in 11. Of course it's very complex and we'll omit it here in favor of concentrating on the issues that we're studying. Nimzowitsch mentions that rook h7 instead and rook h6 both do not work, and therefore he felt that continuing to maneuver was the correct play. So black gets a move, d2. Now rook f8 check, king g7, rook 6 f7 check, king d6. And now we see the king being forced into the center of the board, as mentioned. And white has to defend the bishop, and also the threat black has of queening. So bishop b3. And here Kalinsky played bishop b6, which Nimzowitsch gave a question mark. Better, he felt, was a6, as this gives the king a hiding place. So after bishop b6 comes rook f6 check, and the king has the choice of two evils: return to the side of the board where he will now get mated because the bishop's on b3, or move it into dangerous open ground. Kalinsky of course chose the latter, king e5. We'll just see this quickly. If king e7, rook 8 f7 check, king d8, rook h6, and mate to come. So rook f6 check, king e5, rook e6 check, king d4, rook takes f2, apparently giving back a piece. d1 queen, bishop takes d1, rook takes d1, and now white can play rook e2, winning the pawn, after which white has a theoretical win, and the king being driven to d4 was decisive. So that's another very nice example from Nimzowitsch, and nerves of steel under fire. Another approach with maneuvering is when we combine play on both wings, when for the moment there is no apparent weakness to attack, although they may lie hidden in the position. Nimzowitsch reached this position with black against von Gottschall in Hanover in 1926. So if we take a quick look at what's going on, it's clear that the c5 pawn is weak. It's supported by the bishop on f2, but that is not a stable square for the bishop, and already under pressure from the rook. The h3 and g3 pawns, however, are not weak because there is a lack of operating space for black on the king side. So how should black continue? If you'd like to try and figure it out, I'll flip the board over so we can see it from Nimzowicz's point of view. Yeah, if you'd like to figure it out, then stop the video here. King e5 was Nimzowicz's move. So what's he up to here? After rook b4, he played king d5, which he could have played on the last move, so why did he sacrifice a tempo? The point is that he's putting white in zugzwang here, which won't be the case if he plays king d5 in one move. The king is tied to defending the bishop, which is tied to defending the g3 pawn, and also defending c5. And rook d4 check is just dropping c5. There's no useful discovered check, although it looks kind of dangerous. There's nothing useful that white can do. And any square other than b6 simply loses the rook anyway. So Van Gottschall played h4 here, voluntarily weakening his position. Yeah, h4. If he plays rook b6, then black can play h4. And after gh4, bishop h4, black has king takes c5, attacking the rook and going into a very favorable endgame. So h4, g takes h4, g takes h4, and suddenly black has achieved the operating space that he was in need of on the king side. So now he'll be able to maneuver here. So rook h3, rook d4 check, king e6, because now white does have useful discovered attacks if king takes c5 with the loose rook here. So rook d8, bishop d5, and now Nimzowitsch has created a position in which he can maneuver, attacking the h4 pawn and using the g4 square as a pivot. The process here is typical of maneuvering and can be summarized as follows. First, Nimzowitsch maneuvered against the obvious weakness, the c5 pawn. Using zugzwang, his opponent was forced into a weakening move that transformed a latent weakness into one that was clearly visible and easy to attack. This is often the case with play on both wings. First, a given wing is attacked, often a specific pawn weakness, and through this pressure the defending side must bring pieces away from the other wing, which then creates weaknesses in the second side also. This is the signal for systematic maneuvering against both wings, as we saw Nimzowicz's brilliant endgame against Kalashnikov, great example of that. And these are general rules, and they're almost always true, but there are some exceptions. Here's one example that's an interesting and instructive exception to the rule, because Nimzowitsch acts as though the weakness on his opponent's wing had already been laid bare, when in fact it had not. He had the black pieces here against von Holzhausen in Hanover in 1926. A pawn up, he has a very favorable endgame. In his own words, Nimzowitsch now hurried to clarify the situation with his move rook h6 and points out that b5 is the correct way to play, with the struggle for control of the queen's side. However, before this opening of the position, it's much more useful if black provokes weaknesses on the king's side that he can attack at the same time, and this explains Nimzowicz's move rook h6. So the h-pawn's attacked, h3, rook g6, putting pressure to g2, although the knight's covering it for now. So rook e2, a6, rook f4, b5, b3, rook g5, g4, rook g e5, king c3, and now a5. It's a great move. The point is that now white has weakened the h3 pawn, and this, in conjunction with the possibility of removing the blockading knight on e3, means that all black now needs is room to maneuver and a pivot from which he can operate, and he can maneuver to victory. And this explains the move a5, as will become apparent. So rook ef2, now a4 with the threat a takes b3, and then b takes c4, which is going to open files for the black rooks. So b takes a4, now b takes c4. So rook f8, white wants to exchange a pair of rooks before capturing on c4. Rook 5 e7, rook takes c8, rook takes c8, knight takes c4, knight takes c4, king takes c4, rook a8. And now we see the method of Nimzowicz's play. He's gained the necessary space he needs in the A, B, and D files, and weaknesses to attack at the same time. And D4 is the pivotal square here. So rook F7. If instead king B3, king D5. So rook F7. Now rook takes A4 check. King B3, king C3 was probably better. So rook B4 check, king C3, rook B7, saving G7. Rook F5, rook A7, king C4, rook A4 check, king B3, rook D4. And this is the pivot square. So rook E5, now king D6, rook E8, rook D3 check, king C4, rook takes H3. This weakness that was provoked falls, and this is the fruits of black's labor, the winning of territory has resulted in the winning of material, and now black is winning quite easily. Rook takes e4, rook a3, rook e2, rook a4 check, king b5, rook takes g4, a4, rook b4 check, and black went on to win in less than 20 moves. So a very nice example again from Nimzowitsch. Okay, that's the end of part 1.